The Varric Dominion had been at war for 11 years before they allowed humanity to observe the front lines. Not participate. Not advise. Observe. That distinction mattered to the Varric High Council, a body of 7 species bound by centuries of mutual defense treaties and a shared, quietly held belief that humanity despite its rapid technological development was still too new to be trusted with anything that actually mattered. Earth's Interstellar Liaison Office had accepted those terms without complaint. They always did. 31 years of first contact, and human diplomats had perfected the particular discipline of agreeing to unfavorable conditions while saying absolutely nothing that could be used against them later. Senior liaison Marcus Ewan had been stationed aboard the INS Meridian a Varric Coalition command vessel for 4 months when the incident occurred. His role was formally listed as embedded observer. Informally, every Varric officer aboard treated him as a slightly puzzling piece of furniture that occasionally asked intelligent questions. That changed the morning the Queen's ceremonial combat armor came back from the Battle of Veth Crossing with a fracture no Varric engineer could explain. The Battle of Veth Crossing had lasted 9 hours. By Varric standards, it was a moderate engagement a contested orbital insertion over a moon the Collective called Veth 3, and the Dominion called something unpronounceable that Ewan's translation matrix rendered as the place that argues with gravity. Queen Commander Sarah Vall had led the boarding assault personally. That was standard Varric doctrine for engagements involving territorial claims the sovereign's direct presence carried legal weight under coalition law, establishing physical dominion over contested ground. It was politics and warfare fused into a single act, and the Varric had been doing it for 400 years. Her armor a suit of Varric-hardened composite rated to withstand directed plasma at close range had performed flawlessly through 8 hours and 47 minutes of combat. Then something hit it that it wasn't designed to stop. The Collective had deployed a new weapon in the final push. Intelligence would spend weeks arguing about what to call it. For now, the engineering team aboard the Meridian was calling it a phase displacement emitter, which was a confident-sounding name that disguised the fact that nobody understood what it had done or how. What they did know, the fracture in the Queen Commander's left pauldron was not a crack. It was a structural impossibility. The composite material had separated at the molecular level along a plane that shouldn't have been able to carry stress. The armor hadn't broken so much as it had been convinced, at the material level, to forget how to hold itself together. And when you repaired Varric composite armor, the repaired section needed to be molecularly continuous with the original, or the suit's internal pressure integrity would fail under combat loads. Which meant this wasn't a cosmetic problem. This was a problem that would kill the Queen Commander the next time she wore it into battle. The engineering bay of the Meridian was large by any standard. 30 meters wide, lit in the pale blue-white frequencies the Varric preferred, and occupied by 11 of the finest materials engineers in the Coalition fleet. Ewan stood at the observation rail on the upper level, the position he'd been assigned when informed that the Queen Commander wished the fracture repaired before the next engagement cycle which was, according to the mission clock, 43 hours away. He watched the engineers work for 2 hours. He watched them argue in 3 different languages, run 17 scans, and produce documentation that was almost certainly detailed and almost certainly useless. He watched one engineer a Sonari, with the long-fingered dexterity her species was known for attempt a molecular bridge across the fracture, and then immediately watched the bridge fail when the composite rejected the introduced material signature. He watched the senior engineer, a Varric named Vor Aleph, step back from the bench and stand very still in the way that Ewan had learned to recognize meant something was being formally acknowledged without being formally said. They didn't know how to fix it. 41 hours remained. Ewan looked at the armor for a long time. The fracture was visible even from the rail a pale diagonal line across the pauldron, subtle enough to miss at a glance but deeply, structurally wrong. He had seen something like it before. Not in person. In documentation specifically, in a classified technical report from Earth's Materials Research Division at the University of São Paulo, authored 3 years ago by a doctoral candidate studying stress propagation in crystalline composites under oscillating electromagnetic fields. The candidate had been investigating a theoretical weapon concept that the UN Defense Research Committee had ultimately deemed too speculative to fund further. The report had included images of a particular type of fracture. Ewan had read that report because reading obscure materials science papers was something he did during long transit cycles, a habit that his colleagues found baffling and that he had never been able to adequately explain. He found the patterns of material failure oddly beautiful. The way Stress found the hidden geometry of a structure and spoke it aloud. He looked at the fracture again. He descended the observation stairs. The engineering bay fell noticeably quiet as he reached the floor level. 11 engineers, various species, all with varying degrees of politely disguised awareness that a human was walking toward the Queen Commander's damaged armor. Vor-Aleth turned to face him. The Varric senior engineer was nearly 2 meters tall, with the broad, layered shoulders of his species and the careful, measuring expression of someone who had just spent 2 hours failing at a problem and was not particularly eager for commentary. Liaison Yuan, Aleth said. His translator rendered it in precise, slightly formal standard. The observation rail Euro. I know what a phase displacement fracture looks like, Yuan said. He kept his voice level. Not challenging, not apologetic Euro, just factual. And I think I know how to repair it. The silence in the bay was the particular kind that forms when a room full of experienced professionals encounters a statement that violates their working assumptions. It wasn't hostile. It was the silence of recalibration. Aleth studied him for a moment. The engineer's expression moved through something Yuan couldn't quite read. Euro, skepticism, yes, but beneath it, something more careful. The recognition, maybe, that they had 41 hours and no alternatives currently in progress. The Queen Commander's armor is not a demonstration surface, Aleth said. No, Yuan agreed. It's a life safety system with a 41-hour repair window. I understand the stakes. Another silence. Then Aleth stepped aside. Not all the way Euro, he positioned himself close enough to intervene if needed, which Yuan thought was entirely reasonable. But the bench was accessible. The armor was within reach. Yuan set down his datapad, pulled up the Sao Paulo report from his personal archive, and began to read the relevant section a second time. Euro carefully, making sure he had it right before he touched anything. He had one chance. He intended to use it correctly. The first thing Marcus Yuan asked for was a spectrographic breakdown of the armor's base composite material. Vor-Aleth provided it without comment. The readout appeared on the bench's integrated display. Euro, a dense molecular map of the Varric hardened composite, 11 distinct polymeric layers bonded at temperatures and pressures that required orbital manufacturing platforms to achieve. Yuan studied it for 4 minutes. Nobody interrupted him. The Varric composite was genuinely impressive. Earth's materials science community had been aware of it for roughly a decade, having obtained limited samples through official exchange programs, and the consensus was that humanity was perhaps 15 to 20 years behind matching it in full production capability. The Varric had several centuries of industrial refinement behind the material. It was not the kind of thing you improvised repairs on. Which was, Yuan reflected, precisely why the fracture was such a problem. Every repair methodology the coalition engineers had attempted was based on the assumption that you fixed Varric composite with Varric composite. Matching material, matching molecular signature, like healing scar tissue with a skin graft. The phase displacement effect had made that impossible. What it had done Euro, what Yuan suspected it had done, based on the Sao Paulo documentation Euro, was alter the resonant frequency signature of the material along the fracture plane. Not destroy it. Not melt it. Simply shift it, so slightly that standard scans might not catch it, but enough that introduced repair material of the same base type would register as foreign and be rejected at the bond level. It was elegant in the way that all genuinely dangerous weapons were elegant. It exploited a feature of the armor's own integrity systems to make itself unrepairable by standard means. The solution, if there was one, had to approach from a different angle. I need to know the resonant frequency range of the composite and its undamaged sections, Yuan said. A Sonari engineer Euro, the one who had attempted the molecular bridge Euro, moved to the secondary scanner and ran the measurement. She read out the result in Varric technical notation, and Yuan's translation matrix converted it into something his own instruments could work with. He ran a calculation on his datapad. Then he ran it again, adjusting for the atmospheric pressure difference between the Meridianus engineering bay and the conditions under which the armor had been struck. The fracture plane is vibrating at approximately 0.003 terahertz above the base material's natural frequency, he said. That's why the bridge failed. You were trying to bond across a frequency boundary. The Sonari engineer looked at her own data, then back at Yuan. That delta is within measurement error margin, she said. It was not a dismissal Euro, her tone was genuinely analytical. Normally yes, Yuan agreed. But the phase displacement weapon isn't working at normal energy scales. It's working at the edge of measurement error deliberately. That's the design. He showed her the Sao Paulo paper's theoretical section Euro, the part that had described, in purely hypothetical terms, a weapon optimized to operate precisely within the noise floor of standard military scanning equipment. Below detection. Above repair. The Sonari read for a moment. Her expression a euro harder to read than Varek, but Ewan had been studying alien facial cues for 4 years. A euro shifted toward something he interpreted as reluctant interest. If the frequency delta is real, she said slowly, then the repair matrix would need to be introduced at a shifted frequency to match the damaged section. And then gradually walked back toward base resonance as it bonded. Yes, Ewan said. We don't have equipment that can modulate a composite repair matrix at that precision. I know. Ewan reached into his field kit. Earth does. The instrument he produced was not impressive to look at. It was a matte gray rectangular device roughly the size of a hardcover book, with a small display and a contact array on one face. The Varek engineers in the room processed its appearance with varying degrees of concealed skepticism. It was a materials resonance modulator, developed for Earth's deep space mining operations. A euro, specifically for the problem of repairing high-stress composite seals in environments where you couldn't swap out damaged sections and had to work with what you had. The mining industry generated interesting engineering constraints. Things broke in ways they weren't supposed to, far from any shipyard, and the people who designed repair tools for that industry had learned to be creative. The tool could modulate a bonding matrix's molecular resonance frequency across a range that Varek engineering standards had never needed to consider, because Varek engineering standards assumed you'd have access to a proper fabrication bay. Ewan had carried it for 8 months as part of his standard field kit, the way a field medic carries equipment for problems they hope not to encounter. He had not used it once. He had also never once considered removing it from the kit. He calibrated it to the frequency delta he'd calculated. It took 11 minutes, during which the engineering bay remained very quiet. Then he looked at Voralev. I'll need a repair matrix compound. A euro, standard coalition composite, whatever you have that most closely matches the base material. I'm not trying to match molecular signature. I'm going to match frequency first, and let the structural bonding follow. Olive considered this for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. Then he gestured to 2 of his engineers, who moved to the compound storage. Walk me through the process, Olive said. Step by step. Before you begin. It was a reasonable request. Ewan respected it. He spent the next 20 minutes explaining the methodology. A euro, the frequency mapping, the modulated introduction of the repair compound, the gradual resonance walkback that would allow the new material to integrate with the old rather than being rejected by it. He also explained where it could fail. He did not skip that part. Olive listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions, each precise, each revealing that he understood materials science at a depth that Ewan respected. The senior engineer was not simply deferring. He was evaluating. At the end, Olive was quiet for a moment. If you're wrong about the frequency delta, he said, the repair compound will fail at bond initiation and we lose approximately 4 hours of available repair time. Yes, Ewan said. And if you're right? Ewan looked at the fracture. The pale diagonal line. The armor that the Queen Commander would need to wear into combat in 38 hours. If I'm right, you have a repaired suit and a better understanding of what that weapon actually does. Olive held his gaze for another moment. Then the senior engineer stepped back and folded his arms. A euro, not blocking, just watching. Begin, he said. Ewan placed the modulator's contact array against the undamaged composite beside the fracture, confirmed his calibration reading, and began. Repairing the armor took 6 hours. Not because the process was slow. The resonance modulation itself moved at the pace of molecular bonding. A euro, quiet, invisible, measurable only through the instrument readouts that Ewan tracked with the sustained attention of someone who understood that the most dangerous moment in any repair was the one where everything seemed to be going well. It took 6 hours because Ewan stopped 3 times. Not because something went wrong. Because something almost went wrong. A euro, subtle deviations in the bonding progression that required recalibration, small course corrections made before they became large structural problems. He caught each one early. He made the adjustments. He continued. It was not dramatic. That was perhaps the most important thing about it. A euro, the absence of drama. The 11 engineers in the bay had, Ewan suspected, been prepared for a confident human gesture followed by rapid visible failure. What they got instead was a man working with the careful, undivided focus of someone who had accepted that the task was hard and had simply decided to be adequate to it. The Sonari engineer. A euro, Ewan learned her name was Elvas. A euro, positioned herself at the secondary scanner and called out readings at his request. They developed a working rhythm without discussing it. Ewan would ask for a frequency scan at specific intervals. Voss would provide it. Ewan would adjust if needed and continue. After the second hour, Voss began providing readings slightly before he asked for them, anticipating the intervals. He nodded each time. She did not comment on the nods. Vor-Aleth remained present for all 6 hours. He did not interfere. He did not leave. He stood close enough to observe the instrument readings directly and far enough back to make clear that observation was all he was doing. Ewan found the senior engineer's presence grounding rather than pressuring. Aleth's attention had the quality of someone who understood what they were watching, and that understanding was, in a peculiar way, a form of respect. At the 4-hour mark, the fracture line began to close. Not visibly, not at first. The change showed in the scanner data before it was apparent to the eye. The frequency differential between the repair compound and the original material was narrowing, the modulator steadily walking the new material back toward the armor's base resonance. As it did, the bond integrity readings climbed. Slowly. Then with increasing confidence. One of the younger engineers, a Varek, perhaps 8 years out of technical training by Ewan's estimate, moved closer to the bench without quite intending to, drawn by the scanner display. He stopped when he noticed he'd moved, glanced at Aleth, and then stayed where he was when Aleth gave no indication that it was inappropriate. By the 5th hour, 4 engineers were standing close enough to see the readings directly. By the 6th, all 11 were present at the bench. Nobody had arranged this. Nobody had called anyone over. It had simply happened, gradually, as the data on the display became too interesting to observe from a distance. When the bond integrity reading reached 99.7%, standard specification for Varek composite was 97%, Ewan set down the modulator. He did not announce that he was finished. He simply stopped working, and the cessation of his focused attention was visible enough that the bay registered it. Voss ran a full-spectrum scan without being asked. The results populated the main display. The fracture was gone. Not covered. Not bridged. Gone. Integrated, the repair compound fully continuous with the surrounding material, molecularly indistinguishable from the original at every frequency the scanner could measure. The resonance signature across the entire pauldron was uniform. The internal pressure integrity of the suit was restored. The young Varek engineer said something in his native language that Ewan's translator rendered as approximately, "That's not possible." Ewan thought that was slightly unfair to the S.A. Paulo doctoral candidate whose theoretical framework had made it possible, but he understood the sentiment. Vor-Aleth stepped forward and studied the readings himself. He spent nearly 3 minutes with the data, more time than was strictly necessary to confirm what the numbers said. Ewan recognized the extra time for what it was. The experienced engineer's reluctance to accept a result before he had personally verified every number. Finally, Aleth straightened. "The repair is structurally sound," he said. It was a statement of professional fact, delivered in a professional tone. But he looked at Ewan when he said it, and the look contained something the words did not. "Thank you for the compound," Ewan said. "The modulator is calibrated to your composite's base frequency now. If you encounter this type of fracture again, I can document the protocol." "That would be useful," Aleth said. Pause. "The Queen Commander will be informed that the armor is repaired," the senior engineer continued. "She will be told that the repair was completed within the required window." Ewan nodded. "Standard procedure. The Sovereign's equipment restored to operational status, that was the headline. The how was engineering documentation. She will also ask," Aleth said, "who performed the repair." The bay was quiet. Ewan had not considered this specifically. He had been focused on the task. He considered it now and found he didn't have a strong opinion about it. "That's your decision," Ewan said. "I'm an observer." The repair was a team effort, Voss ran the frequency scans throughout. "Without accurate readings, I couldn't have maintained calibration." Voss, from the secondary scanner station, said nothing. But Ewan noticed she was standing fractionally straighter. Aleth studied him for another moment with that careful, measuring expression. "I will report accurately," Aleth said. "That is always what I do." He moved toward the communication station. Ewan began documenting the protocol on his datapad. He had a feeling the documentation was going to matter. He was right, though not in the way he expected. The summons came 14 hours after the repair was completed. Ewan was in his quarters reviewing intelligence summaries on the collective's new weapon deployments when his door signal activated. The message was from the Queen Commander's personal communication staff, a routing that his liaison briefings had identified as something that happened on average twice per campaign cycle, and usually to coalition flag officers. It was not a request. The Varric did not phrase things as requests when they meant appearances. He had 2 hours to prepare. Ewan spent 20 minutes rereading the section of his liaison briefing that covered direct interactions with sovereign-rank Varric military commanders. He spent another 20 minutes reviewing what he knew about Queen Commander Sarah Vall, specifically a Euro service record, documented command decisions, publicly known policy positions on coalition expansion and alien species integration. She was 73 years old by Varric reckoning, which translated to roughly 61 in human years. She had commanded fleet assets for 38 years. She had personally led 4 contested boarding operations, which was 3 more than most sovereign-rank commanders ever attempted. Her record suggested someone who believed that leading from the front was not symbolism but strategy a Euro, that a commander who had never personally occupied enemy ground made systematically worse decisions about when to send others there. Ewan found that analysis credible. He had watched enough Varric battle footage to develop genuine respect for their command doctrine, even where he thought it was wrong. He spent the remaining 80 minutes doing something his colleagues at the liaison office would have found eccentric. He reviewed everything he knew about collective weapons development from the past 3 years, cross-referenced it with the phase displacement effect on the armor, and wrote a 2-page technical memo that nobody had asked him to write. He brought it with him. The Queen Commander's operational chamber aboard the Meridian was functional rather than ceremonial. A working space a Euro, displays on 3 walls showing fleet positioning and engagement data, a central table with a built-in planning surface, a secondary station where her communications officer managed the constant traffic of a running campaign. Sarah Vall was standing at the planning table when Ewan was admitted. She was taller than the average Varric female a Euro, roughly 2 meters, with the compact, dense physicality that the species had developed over centuries on a high-gravity world. Her armor was, he noted, the repaired suit a Euro. She was wearing it rather than displaying it, a choice that struck him as deliberate. She did not look up immediately. She finished what she was reviewing, then turned. Her eyes a Euro, the Varric had 4-lobed irises that registered light across a broader spectrum than human vision, giving them a slightly fractured appearance that humans tended to find initially unsettling a Euro, moved across him with the particular efficiency of someone accustomed to rapid assessment. "Liaison Ewan," she said. Her standard was precise and unaccented. Many senior Varric military commanders learned standard directly rather than relying on translators a Euro. They considered translation lag operationally unacceptable. "You repaired my armor. With significant assistance from your engineering team," Ewan said. The frequency readings that Engineer Voss maintained were essential. Sarah Vall's expression shifted slightly. "Olith told me you would say something like that." Ewan waited. "He also told me," she continued, "that without your instrument and your identification of the frequency differential, the suit would have remained unrepaired. That Voss's readings were accurate because she knew what you needed her to measure. That the methodology was yours. The theoretical basis was developed by a human researcher 3 years ago," Ewan said. "I applied it. I wouldn't characterize that as a Euro. I am a commander," Sarah Vall said. "I do not have the luxury of false modesty in my assessments, and I do not extend it to people I am trying to accurately evaluate." She paused. "Sit." Ewan sat. She sat across from him, which was, he knew from his briefings, a gesture of rank equivalence that Varric commanders did not use casually. "The weapon that fractured my armor," she said. "Tell me what you know about it." Ewan placed the memo on the table between them. "Everything in writing," he said, "and some additional context." She looked at the document. Then she looked at him. "You prepared this before you arrived?" "Yes." "Why?" Ewan considered the question. "Because I thought it might be useful. And because the repair told me things about the weapon's design philosophy that seemed worth recording while the details were fresh." Sarah Vall took the memo. She read it with the same undivided attention that Olith had given to the scanner data a Euro, the focus of someone who read to understand rather than to confirm what they already thought. She read it twice. "The weapon is designed to be undetectable and unrepairable by standard coalition methods simultaneously," she said. "Not simply to damage armor. To damage it in a way that removes it from service." "Yes. The phase displacement effect isn't optimized for penetration. It's optimized for maintenance disruption. You could wear a suit that's been struck by it through that engagement and never know it was compromised until the next one." The Queen Commander set down the memo. "How many suits in my fleet," she said quietly, "might have fractures we haven't identified yet?" It was not a rhetorical question. That, Yuan said, is why I wrote the memo. What followed was not a single conversation but a working session that lasted nearly 3 hours, involving Aleph, 2 of her fleet intelligence officers, and Yuan's datapad with its copy of the Sao Paulo paper. By the end of it, a fleet-wide armor inspection protocol had been ordered, calibrated to detect frequency differentials within the range the Sao Paulo framework specified. 15 additional fractures were found across 12 suits, all in armor that had been in the Veth crossing engagement. All were repaired using the documented protocol. Yuan wrote up the full technical specification that night and transmitted it through official liaison channels to Earth's Interstellar Defense Research Cooperative, with a recommendation that it be shared with coalition intelligence. In his personal log he wrote, "The collective knew what they were doing. They've been studying coalition armor for years. The question isn't whether they'll try this again. It's what else they've been building that we haven't found the fracture in yet." He slept for 4 hours. Then he went back to work. The collective's weapons development timeline, once you knew what to look for, told a coherent story. Yuan spent the 48 hours following the armor inspections building that story from available intelligence fleet engagement logs, materials analysis reports, signals intercepts that he didn't technically have clearance for but that the Queen Commander's intelligence officers quietly shared anyway, perhaps because the memo had established that he was capable of doing something useful with information. The phase displacement weapon wasn't an isolated development. It was the third generation of a research line. The first generation had appeared unidentified at the time 4 years ago in a minor engagement near the Kashan relay. Collective forces had deployed something that caused unusual failure rates in coalition energy shielding systems. The failures were attributed to manufacturing defects, because the defects looked exactly like manufacturing defects. 24 coalition ships had been quietly pulled back for shield inspections. The collective had gained 3 weeks of operational advantage in the Kashan sector. The second generation had appeared 2 years ago, affecting propulsion calibration systems aboard a coalition carrier group. Again, failures that looked systemic, that disrupted operations without the disruption being clearly attributable to enemy action. The investigation had concluded, eventually, that the propulsion systems were more sensitive to magnetic interference than specifications indicated. Correct technically. Not the whole story. The third generation was the armor weapon. More refined, more targeted. Operating deeper within measurement noise floors. The research line was heading somewhere deliberate. They're not trying to defeat coalition technology, Yuan told the Queen Commander's intelligence chief, a Varric senior officer named Drath Kelos who had the patient, slightly skeptical manner of someone who had heard many theories and retained few. They're trying to defeat coalition maintenance infrastructure. Each weapon targets a system that requires specialized repair capability. Each one is calibrated to be difficult to attribute. The strategic effect accumulates gradually. Kelos regarded him with the expression of a man reviewing a hypothesis against a mental database of previous hypotheses. The collective's strategic objective, he said carefully, has consistently been assessed as territorial expansion along the outer relay network. That's the tactical objective, Yuan said. Territory. But territory is difficult to hold when the force defending it is incrementally degraded and doesn't know why it's degrading. Pause. Show me the evidence for the first-generation event, Kelos said. Yuan showed him. It took 4 hours. Kelos asked precise, occasionally uncomfortable questions. He challenged 2 of Yuan's inferences, and one of the challenges was legitimate. Yuan revised his analysis in real time, which seemed to increase the intelligence chief's engagement rather than undermine his confidence. By the end, Kelos pulled up a display of the outer relay engagement schedule. If your analysis is correct, he said, the next deployment of this research line would be consistent with the development cycle within 6 to 8 weeks. Yes. Probably targeting either navigation systems or communications encryption. And you can identify the specific failure signature in advance. I can identify the frequency manipulation signature if I know what base system is being targeted. The Sao Paulo framework generalizes. Kelos was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need that framework documented for coalition intelligence standards, he said. It was not phrased as a request. I anticipated that, Yuan said. He produced a second document from his datapad. He had been writing on the transit from the Queen Commander's chamber. Kelos looked at the document. Then at Yuan. You anticipated that I would want this. You're thorough, Yuan said. It seemed efficient. The Coalition Intelligence Report, when formally filed, credited the analysis to a joint working group of human liaison staff and Varrock Fleet Intelligence. This was accurate. Kellos had contributed substantially to refining the strategic framing, and 2 of his analysts had located the first-generation signals intercept that confirmed the research line timeline. What the formal report did not capture, because formal reports rarely captured such things, was the tone of the working sessions. The way that Kellos's analysts had begun bringing their own documentation to Ewan, not waiting to be asked. The way that the senior communications officer had started routing certain signals intercepts to Ewan's station as standard procedure. Ewan noted all of it in his personal log. Not as evidence of anything precisely. More as documentation of a shift in the ambient assumptions of how he was being treated. A gradual recalibration, the social equivalent of what the repair compound had done at the molecular level. Meeting at a new frequency. Adjusting until something held. He transmitted a summary back to Earth's liaison office, flagged for senior review. The response he received 47 hours later was a terse acknowledgement and a query about whether his observer status protocols were being observed. He read it twice and then sent back an equally terse confirmation that all protocols remained intact and that the intelligence value of the working relationship appeared significant. He did not receive a follow-up response. Earth's bureaucratic infrastructure, Ewan had long ago concluded, was genuinely excellent at identifying problems it had not anticipated and genuinely poor at recognizing opportunities it had not planned for. This was not unique to Earth's bureaucracy. It was characteristic of large organizations in general. The Varrock High Council displayed the same tendency at scale. What was slightly more frustrating was that the opportunity in front of him was becoming more visible with each day, and he was operating without a clear mandate to pursue it. He put the frustration in a separate mental compartment and focused on what he could control. He could control the quality of his work. He could control the accuracy of his analysis. He could control whether, when the next collective weapon appeared, the coalition fleet was better prepared to identify and respond to it than they had been at Veth Crossing. He chose to control those things. 3 weeks later, a different kind of message arrived from Varrock High Command that changed the parameters of what he was permitted to control. The formal title of what Varrock High Command offered Marcus Ewan was Technical Advisor, Integrated Coalition Defense Research. The informal reality was something that had not previously existed. A human embedded not as an observer but as an operational member of a Varrock Fleet Command staff, with direct access to coalition intelligence systems and the formal authority to recommend protocols across the fleet. The offer came through official channels, processed with the precise bureaucratic formality the Varrock applied to anything with treaty implications. It had been reviewed by the High Council's legal division, cleared by coalition species integration protocols, and attached to a 14-page document that Ewan read carefully because 14 pages from Varrock legal staff meant 14 pages of things that actually mattered. The document was fair. More than fair, given the precedent it represented. His advisory recommendations would require co-authorization from a Varrock flag officer, a constraint he thought was reasonable and would probably have requested anyway. His intelligence access was broad but bounded. His authority was real but reviewable. Queen Commander Sarah Vall had sponsored the offer. The document said so plainly, which meant it was meant to be known and carried weight. He had been given 1 hour to decide before the offer was escalated to Earth's liaison office for political negotiation, at which point it would almost certainly survive but become substantially more complicated. Ewan read the 14 pages twice. He sat for a while with his datapad dark in his lap, looking at the gray wall of his quarters aboard the Meridian, listening to the faint vibration of the ship's drives. He thought about his briefings. The ones that had told him, with various degrees of politeness, that humanity's role in the coalition was as a junior partner, valuable but not yet trusted with operational influence. He thought about how those briefings had been written in good faith, based on accurate assessments of the political situation at the time. He thought about how assessments required updating when situations changed. He thought about the S.A. Paulo doctoral candidate who had written a paper that nobody funded and that Ewan had read during a long transit cycle because he found material stress patterns beautiful. He thought about the 15 fractures that had been repaired before they became operational disasters. He thought about a research line the collective had been executing for 4 years, patient and invisible, and how close it had come to continuing undetected indefinitely. He thought about his personal log entry. What else have they been building that we haven't found the fracture in yet? At the 40-minute mark, he transmitted his acceptance. Then he drafted the message to Earth's liaison office, which was considerably harder to write than the acceptance. Not because the decision was wrong he was confident in the decision but because the liaison office had people in it who had spent years carefully managing the pace of human integration into coalition structures, and who had good reasons for the pace they'd chosen, and who were going to have legitimate concerns about a field officer changing that pace unilaterally over a matter of weeks. He wrote the message with the same attention he'd brought to the fracture repair. He explained the situation clearly. He laid out the reasoning. He identified the risks. He did not apologize for the decision, but he was specific about why it was his to make within his liaison mandate. He sent it. The response would take time. Political decisions at that level always did. In the meantime, he had work. The first thing Yuan did in his new capacity was commission a systematic review of coalition armor specifications across all member species, cross-referenced with the Sao Paulo frequency manipulation framework. The Varrock were not the only species in the coalition. There were 6 others. The Sonari, whose ships he was aboard, the Kashan, who specialized in electronic warfare, the Keth, whose engineering traditions predated most others in the coalition by 2 centuries, and 3 smaller allied species whose designations his translation matrix rendered in ways he still occasionally found confusing. Each species had different material science traditions, different base composites, different bonding methodologies, different maintenance infrastructure. What the Sao Paulo framework predicted, and what the first 4 hours of the review confirmed, was that the collective's research line had not been optimizing against Varrock armor specifically. It had been optimizing against all of them. The frequency manipulation approach was general. You could tune it to any crystalline composite structure once you had adequate material samples. The collective had been collecting those samples through salvage operations, through espionage, through the ordinary detritus of 11 years of intermittent warfare for a long time. Yuan presented the expanded analysis to Kelos and 2 representatives from other coalition member species intelligence services at a joint working session that the Queen Commander attended. The atmosphere in the room was different from Yuan's first engineering bay meeting. That had been skepticism managing a single problem with a deadline. This was a group of experienced intelligence officers processing the implication that a threat they'd been tracking at the tactical level was actually strategic in scope. Nobody spoke for a moment after Yuan concluded his presentation. Then the Keth representative an older individual whose species communicated partly through bioluminescent patterning that required interpretation produced a pattern that Yuan's liaison briefings described as the equivalent of a very quiet, very serious acknowledgement. If this assessment is correct, the Kashan officer said, the collective has had a materials vulnerability advantage over the entire coalition for approximately 4 years, and we have not known it. Yes, Yuan said. And this was identified, she continued, because a human liaison officer read a paper from his species research archives during a transit cycle. Pause. That is an uncomfortable fact, she said. It was not unkind. It was analytical. It is, Yuan agreed. The paper was theoretical. Nobody thought it was immediately relevant. That's how this kind of threat works it lives in the gap between theoretical and immediately relevant. He looked around the room. I'd like to propose a systematic way to close that gap, he said. Not just for this research line. As an ongoing function. Kelos leaned forward slightly. Explain. Yuan pulled up his next document. He had been writing it for 2 weeks. The document was 43 pages long and had a deliberately unimpressive title. Proposal for an Integrated Technical Threat Assessment Working Group, Coalition Defense Research Division. Yuan had learned from experience that ambitious proposals with ambitious titles tended to generate political resistance before the content was read. A working group with a long, procedural name generated institutional indifference, which was much easier to convert into quiet approval. It was not a proposal for human dominance of coalition defense research. He had been careful about that, careful in ways that were genuine, not strategic. Humanity's advantage in this situation was specific. A particular research tradition developed in the context of deep space industrial operations that had produced tools and frameworks the Varrock hadn't needed and therefore hadn't developed. That advantage was real and it was narrow. Building an institution on a narrow advantage was how you ended up with structural fragility. The proposal was for something different. A standing working group that would systematically survey research literature across all coalition member species and across human archives the theoretical papers, the unfunded proposals, the doctoral dissertations that had been filed and forgotten looking for frameworks that could address threats that current military doctrine didn't anticipate. The Sao Paulo paper was the model case. A human researcher had modeled a weapons concept theoretically, military funding committees had rejected it as impractical. It had sat in an archive. The collective had built the weapon anyway, and it had taken a random liaison officer's reading habits to connect the dots. That chain of events was not a success story. It was a near miss. The working group would be multi-species. Each member species would contribute research staff drawn from their academic and industrial archives, not their active military programs. The function was specifically not intelligence a euro, it was pre-intelligence. Finding the frameworks before threats materialized, rather than reverse engineering weapons after they'd been deployed. Ewan had not written the political sections himself. He'd consulted with Kellos and with one of the Sonari political liaisons who understood coalition institutional dynamics better than he did. Those sections were careful and accurate. The proposal made no claims about human leadership of the group. It proposed a rotating coordination role assigned by expertise and workload rather than species hierarchy. He presented the proposal in full at a formal session attended by representatives of all 7 coalition member species. It took 4 hours. The questions were good. Genuinely good a euro, the kind that revealed people were engaging with the substance rather than the politics. The Cashin officer asked about research classification boundaries. How would the working group handle theoretical frameworks that were adjacent to active weapons programs? Ewan had prepared for this. The answer involved a review protocol that kept the working group's outputs in a pre-classification space, with clear escalation criteria. The Keth representatives' questions came through interpreter and bioluminescent translation and took longer to resolve, but they were sharper than any of the others. The Keth were the oldest engineering tradition in the coalition, and the representative wanted to know specifically how the proposal would handle knowledge asymmetries a euro cases where one species' theoretical understanding was significantly more advanced than another's. The same way any collaborative research handles it, Ewan said. You document what you know, you document what you don't know, and you share both. The value of the working group is precisely that the gap in one species' knowledge is often filled by another's theoretical work a euro, even when neither knew the other was relevant. He paused. The essay Poundo Paulo paper was written without any knowledge of Varec composite materials. It was purely theoretical in a human context. Its relevance to a coalition weapons threat was visible only from a position that had access to both the paper and the Varec armor specifications. That's the function of the working group. Not any single species superiority. The overlap. The Keth representative produced a bioluminescent pattern that his interpreter rendered as asterisk. That is how knowledge has always worked. The question is whether institutions can be made to work the same way. Asterisk. Yes, Ewan said. That's the question. The vote was not unanimous, because nothing important was ever unanimous in a 7-species coalition. 5 member species voted to approve the working group in principle, with the establishment of a formal treaty framework to follow. The Cashin abstained pending review of the classification protocols. The Keth delegation requested an additional 60 days to consult their scientific community before committing, which was both culturally expected and entirely reasonable. Queen Commander Sarah Vall, attending as a witness rather than a voter a euro, military commanders did not vote on coalition institutional structures a euro, said nothing during the session. She left before the formal conclusion. Ewan found a message from her on his communication terminal when he returned to his quarters. It said, in Varec standard, precisely 4 sentences. Asterisk. You came aboard this vessel as an observer. You are leaving as something else. I do not know the precise word in your language. In mine, it is closest to the title given to an engineer who has found the fracture before the structure fails. Asterisk. He read it 3 times. He filed it in the section of his personal archive he maintained for things that were difficult to categorize. The formal establishment of the Integrated Technical Threat Assessment Working Group a euro, the ITOG, abbreviated in a way that nobody in any species found elegant a euro, took 14 months, 3 treaty amendments, and a political negotiation process that Ewan was gratefully not required to lead. During those 14 months, the working group operated informally on provisional authority granted by the Queen Commander's Fleet Command and quietly ratified by the coalition members who had voted yes. In that time they identified 2 additional collective research lines. The first was a navigation disruption system operating on principles that had been described, in purely theoretical terms, in a Keth academic journal 40 years ago. The Keth's own research staff had found it a euro flag during the literature survey that the working group's first session had commissioned. Identifying it took 11 days. Developing a countermeasure took 6 weeks. Deploying the countermeasure across the coalition fleet took 3 months. The collective deployed the navigation weapon in the 7th month. It found a fleet that had been waiting for it. The second was still being analyzed when the treaty framework was finalized. It was more complex than either the armor weapon or the navigation system operating principles that none of the coalition's research staff fully understood yet, from a theoretical framework that appeared to originate in Sonari materials science from 60 years ago, repurposed in ways the original researchers had almost certainly not considered. Ewan was leading the analysis team personally when the formal ITOG mandate came through. He read the authorization document. He set it aside. He went back to the analysis. He was looking at a specific pattern in the data a resonance signature that kept appearing at the edge of measurement tolerance and he had the persistent, specific feeling that he had seen something like it before. He pulled up the Sao Paulo paper again. Not the section about fractures. A different section, one he had read carefully twice and then filed without fully understanding why it stayed with him. He read it a third time. The pattern in the data and the theoretical model in the paper were not the same thing. But they were related. The relationship was the kind that required standing in a particular position with access to the data and the paper and 4 months of collective weapons analysis in between to see. He began writing. He wrote for 6 hours. When he was done, he had a technical memo that was substantially longer than the first one, and which he suspected was substantially more important. He flagged it for the full working group. Then he sent a copy to Vor Aleph in the engineering bay because Aleph had asked to be kept informed of anything with materials science implications, and because some professional relationships deserved to be treated as what they were, the kind that made the work possible. In the formal history of the collective war, the Veth crossing engagement is described as a tactical victory of limited strategic significance. The footnotes are more interesting. Footnote 47 of the Coalition Defense Research Institute's retrospective analysis notes that the identification of the collective systemic weapons development strategy a finding that shaped coalition defense posture for the remainder of the conflict originated with a materials repair operation aboard the INS Meridian, performed on equipment belonging to Queen Commander Sarah Vall, using a methodology derived from an Earth academic paper that had received no military funding and had been read, as far as records indicate, by exactly one person in any applicable defense capacity. The footnote does not name that person. Ewan had specifically requested that the attribution be directed to the working group rather than any individual. The footnote does, however, describe the tool used in the repair, a materials resonance modulator, developed for deep space mining operations, never designed for military application, carried as standard field equipment by a liaison officer who had never expected to need it. The footnote concludes with a single observation, written by the Institute's lead historian a Varrock scholar who had interviewed most of the primary sources. The most significant contribution to the collective war's eventual outcome was not any weapon system, fleet engagement, or strategic operation. It was the decision, made informally and under time pressure in an engineering bay, to let someone with different knowledge apply it to an unfamiliar problem. In retrospect, this should not have required courage. It did.